Righteousness is a rare and tenuous trait among hunters, a concept that most find too much of a hindrance to even be worth consideration amidst the greed and treachery that surrounds their chosen profession. Some would even likely dismiss the idea as weakness, one more thing that might cause you to hesitate over pulling the trigger a moment too long in the bayou. Not worth the risk when any moving shadow could spell your brutal and sudden end. Righteousness can, however, be an incredible source of power for others, a burning beacon of light against the endless flood of darkness, one that gives them the strength to fight no matter how impossible the struggle may seem. But when righteous purity is marred by fury and pain and rage, when it's left denied too long or pushed too far, the same fire which once gave their soul vital strength can fester into an all-consuming torment of its own, transforming them into something hardly recognizable in the process. The origin of the emulator, the true origin, is only known by those who witnessed its original ignition, or, more precisely, the single surviving witness of the moment this terrifying monster came into existence. Before he was eventually committed to an asylum, plagued by an overwhelming fear of hellfire, the surviving witness's guilt and terror drove him to attempt a confession with his local priest, a one Father Vincent Clemens. Though interrupted before the entirety of the tale could be told, the good father and his journal managed to give us the only insight into the birth of these creatures that we can hope to learn from. Once there was a man of the cloth known as Reverend Jeremy Byrne. Reverend Byrne wasn't exactly the most well-liked among his peers. Yet, his fiery fervor at the pulpit brought many of the faithful to his church just the same. The passion of his condemnations against the local elements of organized crime brought him great popularity in the community. His sermons, so stirring in their power to remind people to take a stand against the evils of greed and violence, gave those who heard them the strength to call out for justice, for more to be done against the men who grew fat and powerful from the crime in their city. Of course, after that, it wasn't long before threats began to arrive at the good Reverend's door. Though we know that Reverend Byrne would eventually be found brutally beaten and bound outside of his own church, we unfortunately don't have very much in the way of hard facts about the timeline between that day and the fateful night 3 men would be sent to drag him deep into the secretive shadows of the bayou, intent on silencing him for good. Father Clemens's journal briefly touches upon a macabre adventure story he had once read, which came to his mind as he listened to the tale of what happened to Reverend Byrne. While ostensibly a tale of fiction, sold for a dime and authored by one Jasper Priest, much of the details in the story are close enough to the facts given in confession to Father Clemens that it was added as part of the unnamed researcher's entry on the emulator. According to the story, the sermons of a man called Reverend Jeremiah railed against a gang of ruthless criminals known as the Black Hand, and had grown popular in New Orleans, even going so far as to attract the attention and support of the mayor. As is the way of such men, when the gang learned of the Reverend and his sermons, they sought to silence him, lest the people begin to finally take a stand against the reign of terror that allowed them to operate their dark business dealings with impunity. First came the threats. A letter sent to Jeremiah warning him of the danger of his words to himself and those he may care about. However, having no family to speak of and the protection of the Almighty on his side, the good Reverend not only continued to speak out against the criminals who would silence him, but even went so far as to have their vile letter published in the papers while still demanding their immediate arrest. When it became clear to the Black Hand that the Reverend would not be so easily silenced, they took more direct action. He was attacked in his bed, his little finger removed, and his tongue split down the middle. But not even that was enough to stop the good Reverend from speaking out, for as soon as his tongue had healed, he was once again in the pulpit, denouncing the sinners who had struck at him with the fire of God's wrath behind every slurred word. It was then that they finally dragged him from his home in the dark of night, bringing him deep into the bayou, where they could be neither seen nor heard by the decent people of New Orleans. Once more, these so-called men threatened Jeremiah, demanding he not only cease his sermons against their organization should he wish to survive the night, but to also give up preaching altogether. At this point, both the confession given to Father Clemens and this tale of brutal fiction begin to bear an eerie resemblance to each other. Reverend Jeremiah, in a voice as though he were reading from scripture, refused their offer with words of warning and admonition both. "But if I say I will not mention his words, or speak any more in his name, his word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it. Indeed, I cannot." Between both fiction and the true life testimony, those evil men beat the Reverend into the mud, but even then, he would not be silent. As the witness who told the tale to Father Clemens would confess, Reverend Byrne, like his fictional counterpart Jeremiah, continued to scream his last sermon into the uncaring sky until those screams turned into an unholy roar of hate and pain. The fire of his faith igniting itself into a hellstorm of flames that burned the good, tortured, abandoned Reverend from the inside out. From a distance, an emulator looks very much like yet another human corpse shambling through the swamp, albeit one which was set aflame and left to burn until nothing remained but blackened bone and charred muscle, some of which still continues to smolder as it wanders the bayou, the fire that still burns beneath their charcoal-like skin, gently illuminating the nearby terrain. Even as they wander alone through the bayou, these creatures continuously vocalize their internal pain as the flames within them endlessly consume the remaining dregs of their humanity. In the event anything living happens to cross the tortured, meandering path of an emulator, the rage which fuels their torment drives these monsters into a blind fury, compelling them to attack anyone that catches their attention. What's worse, any unfortunate hunter who pierces the brittle flesh of these twisted and tortured souls will abruptly discover exactly how hot the fire beneath still burns. An explosion punctuated by howls of rage, greeting anyone attempting to deal with the threat with anything other than a blunt weapon or poison, the latter of which is especially effective against this fiery menace. Running for your life once they burst into flame is in fact a viable option, if you can run fast enough. After a while, the burning explosion of rage that gives them their unclean strength will finally consume them completely, leaving their burnt remains to sink into the Louisiana mud. Though many of the more religious and superstitious among the hunters drawn to the Louisiana Event have tried to explain the horrors they've seen through the framework of their own beliefs, it's only the case of the sculptor that makes the unnamed researcher consider just how close to the truth the more faithful among their number might have been. Its initial creation, birthed from the righteous fury of a man tortured for the purity of his beliefs in a location that happened to be volatile enough to be touched by the distant influence of the sculptor, seems to give credence to that idea. At least, this time. Now check out these videos on the Meathead and the Grunts for more monstrous lore from the Hunt Showdown universe.